I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. The 2026 Maryland General Assembly session ended mid April, and we are following up with legislators and advocates to understand what happened in the different policy areas. Last week, we had Delegate Heather Bagnall debriefing healthcare legislation. She is the new chair of the newly formed Health Committee in the House of Delegates. This week, we have Senator Brian Feldman, chair of the Maryland Senate's Education, Energy, and Environment Committee, known as EEE. I thought the Health Committee's 317 bills this year was a big deal, but EEE considered nearly 500 bills, including the crown jewel of the session, the Utility Relief Act, which isn't just about utilities, but really the omnibus energy legislation from the Assembly this year. Senator Feldman was last on the show January 5th, 2026, alongside his House of Delegates partner, Environment and Transportation Committee Chair Mark Corman. They previewed the session, including the impact of federal layoffs, the One Big Beautiful Bill, ICE raids, and more. I caught up with Delegate Corman for a mid-session crossover day update in March, and Senator Feldman joined me earlier this week for an energy policy-focused wrap-up of the legislative session that included everything from data centers to ending solar net metering as we know it. Stay with us.
What's the matter? You seem so surprised, glancing in the morning paper tonight. Seems that the French can capitalize, not the execution of the spy. During General didn't die. Watch his family cry. Watch his family cry.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Silver Spring rock musician J.D. Brayton, who goes by the stage name Mr. Tree Frog. The two songs we play in this episode are Halo and Troubled Sleep. You can find his music on Bandcamp. Brian Feldman, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Great to be here. And I was looking, the last time I was here, it was the week before session started. We did manage to consider 1,000 bills in the Senate and 1,700 bills in the House, including my own committee. This was the fourth year of me chairing the committee that has the broadest jurisdiction beyond education, energy, environment. We're dealing with affordable housing. We're dealing with data centers, artificial intelligence, election law. The committee did have 290 Senate bills assigned to it, and about 185 House bills came over. As we walked in the week after I did the podcast with Chair Corman, we were sort of walking into some tension, some action at the federal level, some uncertainty in the legislature with all the different chairs, a new speaker. It's been an interesting 90 days.
With the federal shutdown, the revenue impact of the shutdown hasn't really come about, has it?
Potential, I think, it was not entirely realized. I mean, I think...
Why do you think that's the case?
Through the session, there was a lot of conversations back and forth with the budget committees. But I also would say that some of the tougher issues were punted to post-election world. In other words, things that I think are going to come home to roost next session and the following session, particularly whether it's mandated funding for education and the blueprint and other things. And then also, I think it's a little early to, when you have all that was happening, there is I think, a delayed effect potentially, but we're at high risk. Let me just put it this way. We are at higher risk of a downsizing of the federal government more than almost any state in the nation, and federal contracting work, and having 60 federal agencies. The current president will be president for another 2.5 years.
Let's talk about the big energy bill, which is the Utility Relief Act, that contains so much. It's probably the largest bill this year. What do you think were the key parts?
There was a huge desire to provide some modest amount of short-term relief. And my friends in the minority party obsessed about the fact that it wasn't a lot. But I have to make the point that this was a 100-plus page bill that went well beyond reducing the Empower surcharge, which gave some short-term relief to Maryland ratepayers, by reducing the goals of the Empower surcharge, which, by the way, has been in the press this week and is going to be receiving a lot more scrutiny. Some of the stories that came out about Empower this post sine die, I think, are important. You also have to look at the context of what we did last year, the Next Generation Act, Renewable Energy Certainty Act. We were trying to incentivize potentially new nuclear, new natural gas. This year, I think, because of expiration of, well, number one, what's in the queue, what can get online quicker. And so whether it was the reverse auction bill that we rolled into this piece of legislation, which will allow, I think, the possibility of an auction process using so-called alternative compliance payments to leverage that to try to get projects online. We had to revamp our net metering program, which is running up against a statutory cap of 3,000 megawatts, and make plans for a successor program. We did, I think, things that are beyond short term, but a little longer term. We did a lot when it comes to ratepayer impacts that are longer term, in terms of like, what can the utilities include in their rate cases? For example, again, holding utilities more accountable on multiple fronts. Right now, they can pay their executives millions of dollars, and ratepayers are on the hook for the entirety of it. Well, we put a cap on how much executive pay is borne by ratepayers, and how much of that is going to be borne by shareholders of your Exelons, Pepcos, BGs.
How much is to be borne by ratepayers?
Our Public Service Commissioner chair, which is now former Montgomery County Delegate Kumar Barbe, makes about $250,000. And so we tied it to about 110% of his salary. And the first 250, 280, depending on that salary can raise, will be borne by ratepayers instead of 100%. But if you want to pay $14 million salaries to the CEO of Exelon, is somebody I do know, everything above that 250 plus thereabouts a number is going to be borne by the shareholders of Exelon, not by Maryland ratepayers.
So you mentioned the reverse auction. What exactly does that do?
Right now, we have a fund of money that utilities pay in if they didn't meet our renewable portfolio standard goals. And it's a bit of essentially a penalty. So if you go out on the market, if you're a utility, and you buy energy credits and allowances to help you make you in compliance with our renewable energy goals, if you can't do that, you basically pay a non-compliance fee called an alternative compliance payment. And those go in and are part of the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. That fund of alternative compliance payments has increased pretty dramatically, partly because the penalty is cheaper than going out and getting these allowances, because there's just not enough renewable energy, particularly solar, out there in the marketplace. What we're doing here is leverage that money. that is sitting there to create more clean energy. There's an auction process. The Maryland Energy Administration, in consultation with the Public Service Commission, will run these auctions. The reason it's called a reverse auction is the low-cost bidder wins. There's $100 million of alternative compliance payments dedicated to this particular project for 2 years. We'll see how it works. This is not in perpetuity. And we're trying to leverage it against low bid offers to produce projects that will hopefully achieve some of the goals that we're trying to identify for more in-state renewable energy.
The utilities that contribute to the compliance fund for not meeting renewable standards that are set by the state, when they pay that penalty, does that come out of rate basis?
That's the subject of back and forth with the Public Service Commission right now. Technically, the money that goes in the alternative compliance payment is coming from the shareholders, but then can they go back and recoup it? I would say technically the answer is yes, and we had a go around in a circle discussion about that on the floor. The renewable portfolio standard more broadly is I think needs some significant reforms. What can be rate based? What cannot be rate based? Again, we did a lot here to say yes, you've been able to rate base in the past these various things. Even I think when we were cut off, they get an inducement and an incentive, a half a point of return, they being the utilities, just to join the PJM RTO.
So is that gone now?
Yes, so we shut that down. But there was a court case in Ohio that said that if it's a voluntary process, you join, then you get a half a point extra return utility. Yeah. But if you make it mandatory, then you lose that half point return that you pass on to ratepayers. Similarly, we found some loopholes that has to do with transmission. So right now, when you build an overhead transmission line, you have to go through the whole state the Public Service Commission state process to get a rate of return and a cost recovery. But if you were doing underground transmission through a supplemental project process, you go directly to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, you get a higher rate of return, they rubber stamp your project. It's a huge federal loophole. About $3.5 billion of underground transmission projects have gone through that process, and all that extra rate of returns passed on to our ratepayers. But we got rid of that loophole in this bill.
The virtual power plant part of the Utility Relief Act, how does that work?
Well, we've had something called the DRIVE Act in place for about 3 years, an incentive program run through the utilities to send electrons back into the grid. We changed that a little bit because right now the incentive program is paid by ratepayers. But we are now have converted into a program run by the Maryland Energy Administration as a grant program funded through the Strategic Energy Investment Fund.
One-on-one net metering, which has been a big way to encourage solar adoption because it allows you not to have batteries, is ending latest by July 1st, 2027, when the Public Service Commission has to come up with a new calculation for this, but it ain't going to be one-on-one. So the price that homeowners will get for electrons that go from their devices to the grid is going to be much lower than what they pay.
It's been a very generous for the program in terms of what the quote compensation level is. The successor program, again, we are operating currently under a 3,000 megawatt statutory cap.
Who said the statutory cap?
The General Assembly.
Okay, all right.
And so under the bill, this same bill, this is also incorporated. We do task the Public Service Commission, number one, to come up with a successor program that will, yes, be less generous, no doubt. Again, less of a burden on our ratepayers. But it's been a successful program in terms of incentivizing what we want to incentivize, but we need a new program. The big issue there is the transition between the old program and the new program, and who gets to stay in the old program, and at what point are you going to be in the new program? There was a lot of detail about how that transition will work. The goal is that by July 1 of 2027, the old program goes away, But what if it doesn't? Or what if we're not anywhere near the 3,000 megawatt cap? Those projects that are in the queue, again, you need some market signals and predictability.
Are you saying that there is a grandfathering of old projects that will continue for 20 years or whatever it is?
Not 20 years. It depends on whether the new program is up and running on July 1st, and it also depends on whether the 3,000 megawatt current cap has been reached, or we still have room under the cap. So the bill lays out a whole series of criteria whether you get to stay. If you're far enough along in developing a project, then you get to keep the old. You're still into what they call NEM 1, and then if the statutory cap is exceeded and the new program is up and running, you're going to be under the less generous new program.
The people that already have equipment installed, are they covered for 20 years?
This is about, again, new projects under the new program. And I believe I have to go back, it's been a couple of weeks, well, at least a week and a half since I looked at the details about the grandfathering. But most of the discussion was about new energy and new projects.
So on the one hand, you have the virtual power plant and the Drive Act consequences.
Well, that's Drive Act is a separate.
So you're trying to encourage residents to send electrons into the grid.
Correct.
On the other hand, you're saying net metering is going to become less generous. So, it's sort of a give and take here. Where do you think that balance is? And are you getting at the right balance?
Well, I don't think we know yet. The Drive Act, by the way, has been a pilot program for a couple of years. We don't have the benefit of 5 or 10 years of experience. Net metering has been very successful, but again, we're moving to a successor program that may be a little less generous. I think time will tell. I think don't forget, we do come in back every session.
My other big question is that I have heard that the Maryland Energy Administration has had administrative problems. It has had problems actually administering grant programs like this. What are you hearing? What gives you confidence that they'll be able to do it?
Well, they have a brand new director, Kelly Speaks Bachman, who I've gotten to know. I think she was a great hire by Governor Moore. And I think from what I can see, at least with the benefit of 3 or 4 months of working with her, I think I want to give her the benefit of the doubt of seeing all the changes that I think she's going to bring to MEA. I do think the Maryland Energy Administration in recent years has been viewed as, not a top tier cabinet level kind of at a time when we really, really need expertise modeling, which is why we did pass a bill from Senator Hester, the Strategic Energy Planning Office, to also bulk up all our ability and expertise and forecasting and modeling, all the things that you need to have a robust energy policy. We've been identified as one of only 8 states in the nation that really has no true comprehensive energy plan. We're trying to change that.
Do you think MEA has staffing? I mean, my big concern has been that somehow MEA doesn't have the right staffing in terms of numbers or, the type of people that they're.
I think it has been an issue, but I also would say that's where this Strategic Energy Planning Office comes in, because I think they'll be working together. And one of the big issues identified in the last year or two is we end up relying on PJM for information, or even the Public Service Commission to some extent doesn't always have the right kind of stuff.
Let's talk a little bit about the multi-rate plans and the adjustments that you made. The PSC has had trouble okayed multi-rate plans for utilities, and now they have seen criticism from various consumer advocates and others about these kinds of plans. What is the change the new law makes to the multi-rate planning system? How do you see it?
Probably 30 some odd states in the country use it. There's about 20 some states that think that it's had actually upward pressure on our ratepayer bills. So there's not clarity in the country. But one thing that happens is when you use future forecasting and all there's a reconciliation process that goes on after the fact. And so one thing is that reconciliation if we're going to go with respect to multi-year rate plans, when there's a reconciliation, it's only going to be allowed if it benefits ratepayers. In other words, it's a one-way reconciliation. The second, probably more controversial issue is the use of forecast test years, where you can, instead of, you can project or predict future costs and build that into your model. That was probably the source of a lot of discussion between the House and Senate. The House had a ban, said you cannot, utilities, use forecast test years anymore. We will not allow it. The Senate product said, let the Public Service Commission have a proceeding and focus on forecast test years to determine whether, in fact, that makes sense for ratepayers. And during that 1 year period between now and April 1st, as they do that proceeding, there'll be a pause, and utilities will not be able to use forecast test years during the period when there's the proceeding.
But what is your hesitation? I mean, what is the advantage of having these multi-year forecasted planning?
We had conflicting testimony on that. It does give you a window into where the dollars are being deployed, or where the utilities are looking to deploy, and ultimately capital formation. For example, we had testimony from the utilities that one of the criticisms of Maryland is regulatory uncertainty. We have been identified as one of the worst states in the nation. The worst thing we want to do as a General Assembly is take steps that have some potential impact on our utilities' credit rating, which increases borrowing costs, which ultimately gets passed on to our ratepayers.
Let's talk about retail energy suppliers. You allowed retail energy suppliers to charge over the standard offer service, allowed 3-year contracting. A couple of years ago, you had actually changed, the direction was different. Now, this seems to be a redirection.
I would say no. So one of the criticisms of the so-called SB1 from a couple of years ago is it pretty much shut down the retail supply market in Maryland. Now, I think SB1 from 2024 was good policy because we were finding that there were a lot of bad actors, and that at the end of the day, a lot of Marylanders were paying more, even though they had, quote, choice. And so we put guardrails in place in that bill, but I don't think the intent was to shut down the marketplace for retail supply. So trying to find, what it would take to get the larger players, I'm specifically thinking your Constellations, your Washington Gas, they had their own criteria. And early on, it was like, well, short of a repeal of SB1, we're not coming back. In the Senate version of the bill that we sent to the House, we did not address retail supply at all. What the House committee did find was a couple of smaller players that said opening up some variable rates, have up to 3-year contracts. There can be scenarios, particularly in a situation where you have rising energy costs, and you lock in year one, well, then it will have worked out for you, as opposed to, SOS.
I want to talk about what your bill did for regulating data centers.
The politics of data centers have shifted a little bit. Like, everybody was, from Northern Virginia, everybody wants data centers. Well, now there's some community pushback. It's a little more complicated, I think, politically. But that said, what we did, and this is, if a data center wants to do business in Maryland, the ratepayers of our state should not bear the full cost of the infrastructure. And so what can we do to protect our ratepayers? Last year, we had a study bill to look at the impacts, SB 116, that the governor vetoed, that we overrode a veto. So we'll be getting back on data centers, some of the economic impacts, some of the environmental impacts. We'll get that report back this year. This year, that same Public Service Commission we keep talking about has been tasked with coming back with a tariff schedule. And we'll see how that shakes out, I believe, by September. And the tariff schedule is designed to assign a certain level of economic burden on our deep-pocketed data centers, your Amazons, Googles of the world who want to do business in Maryland. The other part of it is within this bill, and they will have to register and give a lot of information to the state. One of the reasons our bills have gone up is we have data centers applying to locate all over the place, knowing for sure that they're not going to locate in a lot of these places. But if you're up at the PJM grid, you have to assume that they're all going to get built, and that gets built into so-called capacity market, which then ultimately has some impacts on what ratepayers throughout the 13-state grid are paying. So there's a registry that it's going to be, giving us information about water consumption, all this other kind of things that we need to have. And then on top of that, trying to come up with incentives that if you bring your own energy, you get to go to the front of the line. If you do this, you get to go to the front of the line. We're trying to get the good actor data centers, not the ones that are straining our grid and hitting our ratepayers with burdens and infrastructure and the like.
So overall, there seems to be an effort to regulate PJM, the 13-state common market. PJM had not agreed earlier to bring your own energy rules at their level, at the 13-state level. But now you are insisting on it. Do you think that this is going to be defensible in court? Or is the Maryland market attractive enough that the data center people are going to go, okay, fine, whatever you guys wanted, but we want to be here?
I think we'll have to see. I've got a data center coming into District 15 Dickerson. I've got Constellation, who owns Calvert Cliffs, insists that your Amazons are itching to come and partner. So my anecdotal evidence is they're willing to come. And now that they know what the rules of the road are, I think that we're going to see data center activity. Now, the broader issue of PJM and potential legal landscape on anything that happens and what our power is over PJM, I will say PJM has been on the defensive for a few years now. And our former chair of the Public Service Commission, Jason Stanek, works at PJM, and we have a lot of conversations with PJM. I mean, it started a few years ago about the queue. We've been itching to get more power generation in our state. And the queue, it was almost impossible for these projects were sitting for 3 or 4 years in the PJM queue, weren't able to get released. And even when they were, we had regulatory uncertainty in Maryland and all the like. But there was that. And I would say the states have pushed back. We have folks like Governor Shapiro and Governor Moore and others bad-mouthing PJM, and maybe it's time for new leadership. By the way, PJM is undergoing new leadership changes themselves. I would say the landscape is changing.
There was a nuclear provision trying to encourage more nuclear generation, perhaps by allowing a 15% cost overrun be billable to ratepayers. Are you getting interest in nuclear projects in Maryland?
Rose, so last year's Next Generation Act did open up a process to a procurement process, or to try to get new nuclear and also, I would say, new natural gas. A natural gas part of the equation, we do have a project, Constellation. There's a fast track process. There's a project coming to Harford County on that front. Interest on the nuclear part of the bill from last year did not. There was not much action, which is exactly the reason we went back to the drawing board and we went to the nuclear industry and to try to figure out, okay, what would it take? What kind of changes might it take to get more interest on the nuclear side of things? I should make this point, though. People talk about nuclear power and they don't even know we have 40% of our power right now comes from nuclear, Calvert Cliffs. So we are not anti-nuclear. And I think last year we made it very clear that nuclear power is part of our future. Of course, the period of time to go from a nuclear power project idea to actually getting permitting is many, many years, which is why the focus this year was on projects we could get online much quicker than a nuclear power project. We were essentially told we need more flexibility. This 15% number is a guardrail, and we're not going to open up the coffers of Maryland ratepayers. We want nuclear, but within certain parameters, and I think this gives more flexibility to enticing.
Brian Feldman, thank you.
Thank you so much for the invite again, and I always enjoy it.
That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Silver Spring rock musician J.D. Brayton, who goes by the stage name Mr. Tree Frog. The two songs we play in this episode are Halo and Troubled Sleep. You can find his music on Bandcamp. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email producer@ihbpod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Thank you. No, you've done wrong.